Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Peacebuilding Fund's Gender and Youth Promotion Initiative webinar. I hope you can all hear us and see the presentation clearly. Again, welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, depending on where you are. Just a few points before we start our session today. As you can probably see, the webinar is being recorded. This is to make it available, of course, for future use and reference. Please keep your cameras off. As long as you're not speaking. Maybe at the beginning, I'll ask the presenters to keep the cameras on during the round of introductions so they can be introduced. But appreciate if, of course, the microphones and cameras are off if you're not speaking. Questions are, of course, very welcome. Please use the chat or we can have, of course, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. There is time allocated for that, but you can also use the chat function for any questions. The French, just to note that the French webinar will be starting at 10, so from 10 to 11:30 New York time. The links and the times for this for the French session, in addition to the MHPSS session, will be also shared with you, and will be shared, sorry, on our website addresses. First, I would like to maybe start with a round of introductions. Of course, forgot to introduce myself. My name is Shaza Sulaiman. I'm the gender advisor for the Peacebuilding Support Office. I'll ask my other UN colleagues to start. Maybe Birgit.
Hello, my name is Birgit Keinzler-B. I work in the Human Rights Office, UN Human Rights Office. I coordinate the Civic Space unit here, and I'll speak about the Civic Space concept and the UN system-wide guidance note on Civic Space a bit later on.
Amanda.
Hi, colleagues. My name is Amanda Cron. I'm with the Environment and Climate Change team at the UN Human Rights Office, and we're speaking a bit about environmental issues later today. Thanks.
Thank you. And Morse?
Just to add, Shaza, that Morse has a conflicting meeting, so he will join a bit later for the specific presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Tatiana?
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm Tatiana Zhitsinova, working with UN Women Headquarters, Women, Peace and Security Unit.
Our colleague Jewel?
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I was on mute. My name is João Scarpellini. I am the Youth, Peace and Security focal point at PPSO.
And of course, Yelva.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ylva Sköndal. I'm coordinating the Gender and Youth Promotion Initiative here at PPSO. It's a pleasure to meet you all. Thank you so much, Asa.
So as you can see, we have quite a team of from different UN agencies and UN entities. So we're very excited to present this. Just a little note that the presentation will be shared with all of you, of course, later on. And now I think we can start. So the presentation and the session for today, we will, these are the general outlines. We will be, of course, a very brief introduction on GYPI 2021. If you probably all participated in the introductory webinar where we had a much more in-depth introduction of the process and the call. Also another brief overview of the relevant frameworks that guide our work and guide the GYPI. And then we'll delve into the thematic and the subject matter, where we will look at some of the key concepts that we're looking at in our theme this year: civic space, participation, promotion, protection, and then also the highlighted areas that we have highlighted in our call for proposal: land rights, Indigenous peoples' rights, and environmental issues. We will then also have a more in-depth discussion on engaging and consulting with women and youth, which is, of course, very important in terms of a very important expectation in terms of how central it is to the proposals that we expect to receive. And then we will end it with a final question and answer session. Moving on, so in terms of the thematic focus, as we all know, this year we will focus on promoting meaningful participation of women and youth in local peace building. And for this call, local peace building and how we've defined it is, or the definition we've kind of looked at, are all peace building efforts that are focused at the community or subnational level. And we expect that proposals come in two areas. First one is the promotion and protection of civic spaces, notably with an emphasis on land, Indigenous people, and environmental issues. And the second theme is the second priority is the promotion and strengthening of mental health and psychosocial well-being for women and youth as part of local peace-building processes. Now, we will not be speaking, I think it's a short recap basically on all the WPS and YPS frameworks. We've covered this again in depth in the introductory session. Of course, for WPS, it's UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and its subsequent resolutions, and also the 7-point action plan, Secretary General's 7-point action plan on gender responsive peace building. It's, again, this was discussed in the introductory frameworks, but some of the key messages that we kind of try and or want to ensure that all the applicants are kind of very aware of to guide very aware of in guiding their work and guiding their proposal development is how gender does not equate women, that it's also, and it is about power relations between men and women, and we really want this emphasized in the proposals submitted in terms of in the analysis and in the interventions that are proposed, not to just interchangeably equate gender and women. That there are different impacts of conflict and peace building on people. And there are different genders and different gender norms of behaviors can be either challenged or enhanced, can be an obstacle in participation, peace and security processes, and can be enhanced or challenged to promote peace. And finally, that women should not be viewed as passive victims without agency or potential for peace building, and therefore we'd like or we think what should be promoted is a view of how do we use women's agencies, women leadership and potential for these peace building processes rather than passive recipients. For the YPS, of course, it's UN Security Council Resolution 2250. And the others on YPS. Also, some of the guiding key messages that we'd like to share is that we'd like to, I think stereotypes and myths that perceive young men as threats and young women as victims need to be disconstructed and challenged if we are to have a more effective approach towards peacebuilding, youth and peacebuilding. That the majority of young women and men are peaceful and are not a threat, and they are indispensable and important for peace and security and the achievement of for peace building and conflict prevention, and of course using and investing in the potential of youth, young men and young women. Support their resilience and their potential to be able to make meaningful contributions to peace buildings, so that their societies may reap these benefits. So these are just a short mention of the frameworks that we look at, but also, as I said, some of the key messages that we really think and hope the potentials. The use of acronyms again. WPS is in the Women, Peace and Security agenda. YPS is in the Youth, Peace and Security framework and agenda. Yes, so I think I'll move on and I'll hand it over to our colleagues from the OHCHR to take us on to discussion on civic space. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jaza. This is Birgit from Geneva. Thanks again for having us here. This is a great opportunity to discuss a bit the many developments we have seen in and around civic space. And I'll speak about the call to action as one of the entry points as a part of my presentation now. Can we go to the next slide, which is just a quote from the Secretary General that I put there because I think it shows very nicely the shift that has happened in how the UN views civic space over the last years. And that, we really now, the system has decided to understand the space where people can influence their futures as instrumental for any progress on the UN's mandate as such. So there cannot be really sustainable peace nor sustainable development without people being able to participate in the responses we shape and in even in identifying the needs. So, and he really says it also here, it's an underutilized tool for better policy making, and whether you manage to have effective participation or not can be the difference between progress and disarray. Can we go to the next slide, please? Here I put a slide that shows a little bit what the system sees as civic space, because civic space is obviously quite a big concept, but the key rights that we mean when we talk about civic space is the right to participate, which is often not really approached as a right in it, as a separate right in a way. So, there is a bit this understanding by states and sometimes even the UN that we are being nice when we share information or when we invite people or consult people. Really what the rights understanding says is people have a right to participate decisions, policies that affect them. So I think that's one of the big shifts. But of course, we also see on this slide that the right to participate in itself is not effective if it doesn't go hand in hand with the freedoms to really speak your mind, and also with safety for people to speak up. But if you have these three elements in place, then you can hear the variety of voices, then you will actually be able to explore the different options. You will get candid feedback when things go wrong, very important also in the peace and security context. you'll get better, or you will identify and elaborate much better and more effective responses, and the communities will buy into these responses. And as I said, that leads to more sustainable peace and also to much better development outcomes. Can we go to the next slide? Here I just put the definition that the UN system agreed on. I'll just kind of give a summary of it. So you can all look it up in the guidance note. Basically, again, this is the space where people can influence what happens to their lives at all different levels. It starts at the international level and goes down to the very local level. And protecting that space really is a joint responsibility of different players, including the UN system. Next slide, please. The call to action, as I've mentioned, is one of the documents that frame that, you know, basically the SG launched in early 2020 his call to action for human rights, in which he committed the entire UN system to integrate human rights much more systematically in how the organization works. All parts of it work. And the civic space and public participation is one of the headings, along with 6 others. And I just put some of the civic space specific commitments here. But there are also others, and I'm sure my colleagues will speak about this, really more directly related to youth and women, and also to the environment and climate change. I just wanted to highlight the 3rd bullet point on this slide, which refers directly to the responsibility of resident coordinators, UN country teams, and heads of United Nations peace operations, who should develop partnerships to contribute to an enabling environment for civic space. So this is one of the key actions that the call to action mentions, and that I think can also be a useful tool to really rethink some of our approaches. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, I just inserted here also the much older Declaration on Human Rights Defenders that was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1998. I mean, most of you will know this, but the definition of human rights defenders is very broad. It really basically sets all men and women who act for the respect of human rights. So on all issues of discrimination, different rights, who stand up for the rights of others. And I just wanted to mention this because that's the kind of legislative basis for some of the civic space work we are doing. It's very much overlapping with the civic space guidance note, has really kind of, I think, dynamized how the international community views some of these issues, but unfortunately, we also know that a lot remains to be done. And I decided not to dwell on all the threats and attacks that unfortunately human rights defenders and other civil society actors face, but maybe just to mention that there is one SDG indicator about threats and attacks against human rights defenders, in relation to which the Secretary General reports every year, and which shows at least that these threats unfortunately continue at a very high rate, and that also indigenous peoples and environmental defenders are unfortunately on the receiving end of many of those threats. Can we go to the next slide? So basically, we've kind of talked about the call to action, which was the Secretary General's call on for more human rights action within the UN. We've also talked about the Human Rights Defenders Declaration, which is the General Assembly tool for looking at some of the issues. And what I would like now to focus on a little bit more is the system-wide guidance note on civic space that has come out, as I said, in the second half of last year. It was adopted by the Secretary General's Executive Committee, and it kind of tries to make all of the things that I have said visible by focusing on these 3 Ps that you see here. So on the one hand, the attention to participation, to this very important piece that really we need to invest in meaningful and inclusive participation as a precondition for being effective. Then it has this big promotion part, which also includes things like I mean, apart from the fact from attention to freedom of expression and who has freedom of expression, whose voices can we hear, who has access to information, who controls access to information. It also can, of course, is about can people associate and can they assemble when they have grievances. But I wanted to specifically mention the online space. So the need to pay attention to, is the internet free? Who is included? Who is excluded? Again, who controls the space? And really make it clear that a free internet is a very key tool for civil society to function and for vibrant debates to happen. Apart from, of course, the most obvious dimension of access to information. And the 3rd P, as you can see here, is protection. Yes, without effective protection, if people risk being detained or attacked or in the worst cases killed because they speak up, you know, that is a huge obstacle to civic space. So really, when we discuss this, we need to keep in mind the different pieces of the puzzle. And I think in more operational terms, that means everything you do to move one of those pieces forward is a contribution to freer civic space. What can that be? Concretely, in terms of protection, I mean, it can be support to protection networks, really having a network at the country level that can react to threats very quickly and then link people to NGOs or other networks that can actually help address the threat. It also, of course, includes things like supporting national governments or other national institutions to improve the protection of civil society actors and human rights defenders. And just to say, because I haven't said it before, of course, you know, human rights defenders and civil society actors for us include many different categories and among them also journalists. I did one last slide. Can we quickly see it? Not going to go through all the points, but these are just some ideas for what can concretely be done at the country level to operationalize some of the things that I've mentioned. You know, and yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm already a bit over time, so I'll let it. I'll leave.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello.
Hello. Okay, now I think it works again. My mic stopped working. I'll share the presentation again. Okay, thank you so much, Birgit. That is great. I also put the list of resources you shared here. So there's a lot of links to different resources also available in different languages. And this will be uploaded on the website, so it's available there later. Okay, so what is then the link between civic space and peace building? I'll keep this fairly short since it was already covered a lot by Birgit, but as she said, civic space relies on formal and informal channels through which individuals, groups, and communities can play a role in policymaking, decision-making, and thereby also contribute to local, political, and peace-building processes. And the global environment of shrinking civic space impedes the ability of peace builders to promote peace building and sustaining peace. And that is in a nutshell, the link between civic space and peace building. In addition, here we have some examples of programmatic responses, both in terms of youth promotion initiative projects and gender promotion initiative projects. And here you can read a bit more about them. And the titles are links to their sites on the MPTFO Gateway website. So when this will be uploaded, you'll be able to click here and you will reach the website where you can find the project documents and so on for these projects, and there you will be able to read more about them. So I'm not going to go into detail about these projects here, just to share that here are some examples of projects in this area. Okay, and then I would like to hand over to Amanda and Morris, please.
Thank you very much, Ylva. Are you able to hear me well? Great, thank you for that. And thank you for the opportunity to participate as well. So as mentioned, my name is Amanda and I'm with the Environment and Climate Change team at the UN Human Rights Office. And I will be focusing on environmental issues in particular. And I wanted to start by just mentioning that, of course, climate change impacts people's lives and livelihoods, as well as a vast array of human rights. And you see a few examples highlighted here. We also know that the impacts of environmental degradation are worst for those that are already living in vulnerable situations. And this includes poverty, marginalization, and situations of conflict. The impacts of climate change and environmental degradation can also exacerbate conflict drivers. And this is something that is acknowledged in the recent strategy for the Peacebuilding Fund, which emphasizes that the fund will provide more support to managing conflict risks emanating from climate change related pressures on people and resources. And then finally, on this slide, I wanted to highlight the fact that both climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic have compounding negative impacts on inequalities and human rights. And just by way of example here, by September of last year, 92 extreme weather-related disasters has overlapped with the pandemic, and more than 50 million people globally were affected by coinciding floods, droughts, or storms, as well as the pandemic. Next slide, please. So in terms of frameworks and obligations on rights-based environmental action, I wanted to first highlight the Paris Agreement on climate change, which notes that states should, when they take action on climate change, respect, promote, and consider their obligations on human rights. So, for instance, the rights to participation and access to information have been reaffirmed in environmental matters in a number of instruments that you can see here listed on the slide, starting with the Rio Principle 10. Also want to highlight that the right to a healthy environment is already recognized in some form by more than 155 states, and this right can also serve as an important entry point for rights-based environmental action and peace building. Next slide, please. I also want to focus a bit on the situation of environmental human rights defenders, also building on some of the points that Birgit raised earlier in relation to civic space more broadly. So environmental human rights defenders, of course, includes women, young people, and indigenous defenders. They are important allies in the fight against climate change and environmental degradation, and they are often particularly vulnerable in conflict zones, for example, in relation to land rights in crisis-affected contexts. We also know that women environmental human rights defenders are at particular risk here. Next slide, please. Focusing then a bit on women and youth environmental human rights defenders, I want to draw your attention to a report that was issued last year focusing on gender, climate and security, which highlights the potential of women as agents of change in environmental peace building, and also includes several references to women environmental human rights defenders. Of course, children and young persons, as we know, play an important role in the climate justice movement as well. And on the slide, you can see one example of a recent resource that includes an emphasis on policies and practices and efforts by and for environmental human rights defenders. Next slide, please. In terms of some entry points and examples for promoting leadership of women and youth in environmental peace building, I want to highlight 3 entry points here. So the first is that planning and decision making around natural resources can in itself act as a platform to bring groups together for a common purpose. It can facilitate more meaningful exchanges between groups, and in so doing lay the foundation to build more inclusive and equitable natural resource governance. The second entry point is to create spaces for meaningful, informed and effective participation and leadership of women and youth, including indigenous women and youth in environmental decision making at all levels. And here, for example, the National Climate Change Commitments, or NDCs, of South Sudan and Guatemala both emphasize the importance of inclusive mechanisms for participation in the implementation of adaptation measures, and also emphasize a gender-responsive and human rights-based approach. Third entry point that I want to highlight here is to promote inclusive participation and meaningful engagement of women and youth in local and community-based conflict resolution and mediation mechanisms, including as related to land tenure and natural resource governance. And here, as an example, in North Kordofan and Sudan, women in some communities have become actively involved in facilitating dialogue over natural resource disputes. Next slide, please. Looking at some entry points for rights-based environmental peace building more broadly, I want to highlight a few examples here as well. First, I want to emphasize that a rights-based approach results in better outcomes and more sustainable environmental action. And we also know that such action will be a critical element in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And in fact, a number of UNDAFs or UNSTCFs already include specific references to human rights and environment, including land tenure, environmental human rights defenders, as well as climate change and security. And you can see a few examples highlighted on the slide here. Another entry point, which has also been mentioned earlier by Birgit, is the Secretary General's call to action for human rights. And the call to action includes a focus area on rights of future generations and climate justice. And this highlights as a key action to increase UN support to member states at field level for laws and policies that regulate and promote the right to a healthy environment. Next slide, please. I also want to just share a few recommendations for rights-based environmental peace building. To start with, and as highlighted in the call to action as well, to provide support for laws and policies which regulate and promote the right to a healthy environment, which, as we've seen above, can serve as an important entry point for rights-based environmental action and peace building. Secondly, to take action to protect environmental human rights defenders and fulfill their rights. And this is also work that can be done jointly with national human rights institutions. And thirdly, to build on specific references and commitments in UNSDCFs, as well as other national policies and processes. So I mentioned above the nationally determined contributions of Guatemala and South Sudan, but there are a number of examples of policies and processes that can be relevant here, including as relating to biodiversity, the Sustainable Development Goals, business and human rights, and many other issues. So to build on these references and commitments as they relate to human rights and environment, land tenure, environmental human rights defenders, and climate change and security. Next slide, please. So this final slide, as you can see, is just a number of information materials and resources on climate change and the environment, peace building, and human rights. And a number of additional resources will also be made available through the slides that will be shared as well. And with this, I would like to hand over to my colleague Morse.
I'm not sure if Morse is muted or he's on board. He's available already. I think you're muted.
Is it good now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So my name is Morse. I work in the Indigenous Peoples and Minorities Fellowship Program, Indigenous Peoples and Minorities section of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I specifically coordinate our Indigenous Peoples and Minorities section, and also I'm the Secretariat of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. In this session, I would like to give you a bit of an overview of why do we need to look into Indigenous issues in relation to this funding, and why it's important that we have to take into consideration the situation of Indigenous youth, and more especially young women. Just to give you an context, an overview of that, there are about 300 to 370 million Indigenous peoples around the world. There are Indigenous people in every single region in the world, in fact. And that is about 5% of the world population. But if you look at the different indicators of well-being in the world, especially extreme poverty, you will be staring 15% of the world in extreme poverty are supposed to be Indigenous peoples. And this is based on the World Bank research. Now it's interesting because they are only 5% of the world population. Now let's move out of that. Interestingly, when you look at the world's diversity, whether this is cultural, whether this is in relation to traditional knowledge of the environment, for example, there are 7,000 languages in the world, and apparently 80% of those languages are Indigenous peoples. Now that language, when you translate that to diversity in terms of flora and fauna, the cultural diversity, the biodiversity of the world, you are actually looking at Indigenous communities. Can you imagine at some point, 50 years from now, where you only have 4 languages left. Now, we're just talking about languages here. And it's not by accident that when we look at these issues, when we look at protecting the environment, when we look at diversity, cultural and biodiversity, we're talking about resources within indigenous communities. Now, the UN system has been dealing with indigenous issues for the past 30 years. And the way we have held indigenous issues 30 years ago is that indigenous peoples, they are subject for studies. They're not yet right holders as we know now, as we know them now. And if you look at the current mechanism that are specific to indigenous peoples that we in the UN system have developed over the past years, you can also see the historical way and how indigenous peoples are being dealt, even in our own organization. So for example, 30 years ago, we would call them indigenous issues. There are issues, there are people to be solved, they're problematic. And then from issues, then we move on to indigenous population. They are just a population. And then with the plethora of human rights, discussion in this course within the UN system, thanks to women's rights, thanks to rights of the child, people with disabilities and all that, then they realize, oh my goodness, but maybe these people are actually a people. So then the UN started to call them indigenous peoples. And that is how here, for example, in Geneva, we now have some of the most important mechanisms of indigenous peoples. And by calling them peoples itself, based on international standards, we are now recognizing that these peoples, with an S, they actually have a legal standards under international law. So that when we are developing projects, program, policies, and measures for them, based on international standards like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we now have to look at some of the most important and salient rights that are accorded to them. So that when I was looking at some of the most important criteria of this fund, for example, and I look at the countries where we are targeting indigenous peoples, at least there are 15 countries where this fund would make a difference to indigenous peoples. Now take note of this. Even in countries, or I would say it like this, whether indigenous people live in developed or developing country like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, their situation are the same. Their situation are the same. Worse for indigenous women. Now, I'm really hoping that our colleagues who are coming from UNCTs, colleagues who are working for UN organizations, international organizations, I really hope that indigenous peoples, when you look at your project proposal, when you look at your activities, that you do include indigenous peoples, not just partners, but really people who are right holders, like anybody else. And I really hope that, that you give them the opportunity as well to be a part of the decision making and not just a part of the checklist that we normally do. And I really hope that we will sustainably include them in every single step of the project that we do, because that's what we need. We want this world to be a better place in mitigating climate change. We would need the traditional knowledge and environment. We would need not only the traditional knowledge of the environment, but we would like to ensure that those land territories and resources are actually protected, not just for them, but for the generation to come. And I will stop here. Thank you. I will now hand over to Ylva. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Morse. And this is Shaza again. I would like to, after this really nice overview on environmental, land, and indigenous issues, just to give another, examples of the kind of programmatic responses that the gender promotion and the youth promotion initiatives can design around these issues. As Ylva mentioned earlier, the links, the titles of the projects that you see here are linked to the pages of the projects where you can see the documents, where you can see the information around these projects. Please feel free to check them out and see and read them, and kind of just to get an idea of what kind of the details of the programmatic responses. So as an example, in terms of for the Youth Promotion Initiative, this is a project in Cote d'Ivoire around the participation of young people in the sustainable management of forest resources, and as an entry point to strengthening social cohesion in the western region of Cote d'Ivoire. So this was really engaging youth in this process of bringing together forest resource management and social cohesion and peace building with the initiative and the full engagement of youth and leadership of youth. With the Gender Promotion Initiative, these are two projects. One in Yemen, where it was around strengthening the role of women in conflict resolution at the community level, and the specific peace building and conflict issue was around conflict around water and water resources, and the project worked to strengthen women's engagement in the resolution of water conflicts and climate change mitigation in Yemen, in the rural areas and a specific governor. And this is a project where you could really see how an understanding of what limits women and what promotes women and what kind of gender roles can help support existing ones, support their participation in these processes, and what existing ones hinder and create barriers to their participation. The last one is looking at the management of risks linked to environmental degradation through adapting measures or adaptative measures in areas at risk of inter-community conflict. So the project specifically supports women in the management of these risks related to environmental degradation, looking at what are the adaptation measures to climate change, and how to approach them and deal with these risks to avoid inter-community conflict. Thank you, and I think now I hand over to, if I'm not mistaken, Juo to speak on YPS and responsive programming.
Thank you very much, Shasta. Hi, everybody, again. I want to just complement what has been said so far, and it's specifically looking into the youth component of this call, specifically give some tips when you are starting to work on your proposal. So if you can have the next slide. First of all, I think when we are planning for a YPS responsive program, it's very important that we combine both the inclusive, how do we include young people in this process, but also how do we make sure that our proposals are youth sensitive. And by that, I want to just unpack a little bit. Participation, as was mentioned before by Birgit and also other colleagues in this call, participation is a right. And youth participation is one of the key pillars of the YPS agenda. So whenever we're planning a proposal and designing a project, it's very important that we take into account how young people will be part of this process. What are going to be the mechanisms to ensure that they are actively contributing through all the different stages of the process, from the design to the implementation to the monitoring and evaluation. And in addition to that, we understand that in some cases, participation is not always the easiest, especially if we're talking about a conflict setting. Sometimes it's very hard to ensure a safe engagement of young people. And I think participation is important, but it doesn't release us from our responsibility to include youth perspectives in our proposals. And that enters the second angle, which is the youth sensitivity. It is our responsibility to ensure that all the proposals are sensitive to the specific needs of young people. The way a young person experiences life may be completely different than other people in the very same population. So it's very important, specifically when we're doing the analysis, that we try to understand how young people experience that context, how it might be different from other people, from other generations. Do they have specific needs? Do they have specific aspirations? How can we then respond to those needs when we are translating into our proposal? Can I have the next slide, please? And don't worry, we will share the PowerPoint so you can read the actual assessment questions later. But I think the main point here is that whenever we start working on our proposals, we're going to have to think about three main steps. So we need to think about how to include and mainstream youth in the context, in the process, and in the content of our proposals. The context, of course, is where the project will take place. And then I think we need to particularly look into what are the realities of young people in that context? What is the social, political, economic situation of young people? Are their needs different than the needs of other populations? Do they have any specific challenge or barrier that only young people face? Also try to understand how young people are currently involved, how are they perceived in the community, how they perceive the conflict or the context in which they are inserted. All of those things have to be taken into consideration. And so I think one of the big lessons or the key message when we talk about the context is that any YPS program must be grounded in the local context with a very specific youth and gender sensitive conflict analysis. That is a must. The second aspect is the process. And really that's about how you choose to run your project. And for that, we need to think of what are the many opportunities that will be available for young people to engage throughout the process. You also need to think about what are the conditions that you need to provide to make sure that this participation is meaningful. Not all young people will be able to simply, come and attend meetings or dedicate hours in the day. Sometimes they're going to need some support in terms of capacity, in terms of resources. All of these needs to be taken into account when you are designing your proposals. Also, you need to think about how you can make sure you take into account any potential risks and really think about how you prevent and reduce any possible harm you may create in this process. We know the sensitivities of participation, especially in conflict settings. You need to take into account and make sure that all the young people that engage in this process will be safe, will be protected, and will have your support. The last aspect is really the content, is the substance, and it's exactly what are you going to do in your proposal. And I think, again, the key process, the key aspect in this, when it comes to content, is that we really need to be mindful about how our projects will impact young people, especially because of the dynamics, the population dynamics. In some places, we end up having a very large youth population, and there is a wrong assumption that whatever we do will benefit young people. Reality is that not always this is the case. And so whenever we are designing our theories of change, whenever we are designing our actual activity frame, we really need to be mindful about how young people might benefit from the peaceful outcomes. How are they going to benefit from this activity? We also need to question if it makes more sense that we would have some very youth-specific components of our projects, or if we're going to benefit more from integrating young people with other parts of the community. Each case, we're going to have a very different and unique situation. But what is important is whenever we're thinking, if we're going to go for this integrated approach, we need to make sure that we also create some mechanisms to make sure young people are not marginalized or neglected in this process. And something I think it's very important to emphasize that, young people don't need to be exclusive the beneficiaries of the project, but it's important that they are not excluded from the as a beneficiary group, that they also benefit from this process. And in the slides, when you receive it later, you will see there are some recommendations of potential questions, assessment questions, that you and your team can ask yourself to make sure you're framing your approach in the right way. Can we have the next slide, please? Just to conclude, I want to bring I want to provoke you a little bit. Out there, of course, there are many different modules that help us to describe, analyze, and also understand youth participation. By no means I want to present one model and say this is the best one, but I want to bring a very useful way of looking into youth participation for our context of proposals in peace building and development. This is the three-lens approach, and I think what is useful here is that we can think of three very specific ways how young people can be involved in the project. They can be beneficiaries, so they just are more passive. They are, benefiting as the primary target group, but they don't really have agency. Whenever we give them agency, then we start to recognize their role as partners, and so they become collaborators. They're going to jointly make decisions with us. They're going to help us to design and implement the project. But there is also, the other side where actually young people take the lead. We support them, their leadership. We support them to either lead specific components of your project or that they can start initiatives on their own. The reason why I think it's useful to put this frame here is for us to understand that whenever we are designing proposals for this particular call of the PBF, it's very important that for us it's not enough that young people will be the beneficiaries. We are looking into recognizing the agency of young people. Therefore, it's very important that they have a more meaningful role, that they can actually contribute to shaping the proposals, that they can contribute to implementing, if not all the different components, at least some specific components. And so it's useful to have that in mind and really try to always provoke yourself throughout the different stages of the project cycle. What can be the role of young people here? Can we potentially, have them in a more stronger leadership role in this particular component? Sometimes it's not going to be a standard level of engagement throughout the process, but it's important that you always provoke yourself how to give more leadership to youth, because in the process of implementing these proposals, you're also strengthening their capacity and making sure your impact will be more sustainable. Just to conclude, I don't know if there's one more slide on the resource. Otherwise, it's just I want to give a tip. In the website for the call, there is the reference to this Youth Peace and Security Programming Handbook, and that's a very, very useful resource. It was published recently this year, but it gives you a full rundown of what are the different components you have to think from all stages of the project cycle. So I do highly encourage, there is a link. When you receive the presentation, you can click on the link and go straight to the resource. On that note, I'll hand over either to Shaza or to Ilva.
So actually, our UN Women colleagues. Tatiana, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. And it's very easy to go after all these amazing presentations when you have already received a good set of tips and guidance and knowledge. So I think I will pick up from where Joel left it with the three-lens approach. And if we can skip this slide, please. You will see here that women and women civil society actors, they are essential for peace building. Women's organizations are as well. Here you see some of the references to the resolutions where they're specifically mentioned as essential actors. So we can skip this slide and go to the next one. I would like to pick up from where Joel left it with a three-lens approach and really mention that this concept of partnership is an important one when we speak about the true inclusivity in peace building approaches, and really making an effort to bring partners from the civil society into our projects to make sure that our projects are sustainable, that they're well connected with local communities, that they are supporting local actions, and so on. And as Joel already mentioned, very often we tend to build our projects based on assumptions and not really the conflict analysis. So we encourage you to run a very thorough, gender-responsive, human rights analysis of the situation before you come to developing theories of change and project interventions. Based on our practice, we see that a lot of times women are perceived to be vulnerable groups that need protection. In many countries, that is the case. But we also want to stress that building up our projects, we shouldn't be boxing women and young people into these vulnerable groups that only require protection. They are leaders. They are active actors on the ground. And when we talk about local peace building, which is one of the main themes of this year's GYPI call, we really need to go well beyond the traditional understanding of how women and young people are included. So it's not only health and education and all the traditional sectors of social and cultural public life. This is also inclusion of women in security sector, in rule of law, in transitional justice, in planning and financing, environmental governance, and so on. So it's a little bit thinking out of the box and really providing a broader scope of different roles that women and young people really undertake within their societies. Sometimes you will see that those roles can be contributing to peace or contributing to conflict and tension. So that is the task of conflict analysis that you are undertaking. And of course, boxing women and youth into one single group of population wouldn't really give the justice to the whole diversity of this huge population group. So we really need to step out of that identification of women and youth and especially lumping them together as one group of beneficiaries or stakeholders in the project. And we really need to look very well beyond that, look at different identities, age and sex, not forget that there are a lot of non-binary identities that we need to take into account, social groups, political parties, ethnicities, geographical belongings, urban, rural, indigenous groups. Some of the groups will require confidential approaches, maybe focus groups that you can organize to make sure that women and young people are consulted well during the development of the project. Now, when you talk about when do you engage with women for developing of your project, and my answer would be through the entire project cycle. You don't start a project sitting in your office, well, except for maybe this unfortunate situation when we have to deal with COVID restrictions, but there are many ways of getting out there and engaging with civil society and government partners and all the other counterparts in the project development. And you start with conflict analysis, you are already engaging with women for that. You run the consultations and so on. You, of course, speak with women about priority settings. Oftentimes, the priorities that you may see vital for your project may not coincide with the priorities of women on the ground. And then we cannot talk about transformative changes that our projects bring. Project design, obviously, budget distribution, project implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. So all of those steps absolutely require constant, regular, ongoing engagement with women. Now, speaking with how we engage with women, we spoke a lot in this webinar already about ensuring the diversity of representation. So you don't just tick the box and say, we've consulted with women's groups for this project proposal. You need to be very specific what kind of groups you are consulting, what kind of stakeholders you envisage to target within the project. You don't just say women from the north or women from the south. You have to be very specific to what conflict driver and what specific needs and issues you are addressing that will change the life lives of those women. Focus on meaningful participation. Once again, Joelle spoke very well about that. So we want to hear the voices. We want to include and build the ideas into the project. We know that when women come to the table, they don't just bring questions and issues and problems. Oftentimes we hear innovative, amazing and sustainable solutions to some of the long-standing conflict situations on the ground. So we want to hear different voices. We want to include them. We want to hear from those women who represent some constituencies and can communicate information back to their communities if needed. And of course, we want to focus on a do no harm approach. So that's an important one, especially when we speak about civic space. We don't want to make our partners an additional, we don't want to create additional risks for them. We don't want to make them targets, especially those that are women's human rights defenders, environmental defenders, a lot of risky local peace building professions, if I may say, the areas of work that require a lot of courage and include a lot of risk on a daily basis. So we want to make sure that we do not increase those risks. We include those organizations who can contribute meaningfully, but then we look for creative solutions of how we can still support them without creating additional safety and security situations for those partners. We often say that supporting effective women-led initiatives really brings sustainable peace-building results. So we do not recommend to parachute with a UN-led, for example, project into the community without mapping out what really works already in that community. Who are the actors that have the influence? Who are the driving force? And the role of GYPI is to really highlight and put the spotlight on those effective solutions that are already working. So just to focus your attention a little bit on that. Some of the critical pitfalls that you can see on the slide, I probably won't go through all of them, but just the key ones. Women are often consulted too late in the process. So we often sit down and develop the project proposal and then consult on an idea with our stakeholders instead of bringing them and co-creating with them from the onset. We often tend to work, especially the UN, with well-established organizations that have good track records, audit reports, and so on. And this year's call is focused on local peace building. So we need to make an extra effort and do the outreach to community-based organizations, to maybe those groups that may not even form an organization as such, and see how we can bring them into the processes. Once again, I can't underline enough the importance of the thorough conflict analysis when we really look carefully into the different roles of how men are always often portrayed as perpetrators and women as victims and so on. So instead of making those general assumptions, it's always better to do a thorough conflict analysis. Just really quickly on the next few slides, you will see, maybe we go to the next slide. You see some of the useful resources. Obviously, the UN system-wide community engagement guidelines presented last year. Visit has very interesting and important tools and guidance. Next one, please, is a resource from our partners in GAPS and Amnesty and Safe World and Womankind, It's called Beyond Consultation. A lot of interesting tips on how to make sure that different groups and especially women are consulted thoroughly. The next slide presents to you some of the resources on gender responsive conflict analysis. A lot of guiding questions that can help you in your work. So please visit them and good luck to you all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you. Hello? Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you, colleagues, for the presentation and all the information. Again, colleagues attending, please feel free to write up your questions at the chat. And yes, the PowerPoint presentation will be shared, and this session, the webinar, is also being recorded, so it will also be available for later reference and access. I think we have one question, which is on women's access to land. And how about yes, I think they feel not enough focus was given to women's access to land. I don't know if any of the colleagues feel there's something they can elaborate a bit more on this issue on women's access to land, whether from experience or from the information and the data we have. The next question is on the indigenous issues. A definition for indigenous across the countries. In some countries, the population are more or less homogeneous. Should the definition be adapted to that context? So in Somalia, as an example, should we refer to marginalized groups, example, minority clans, ethnic clans, internally displaced people? So I think if I understand correctly, is that how would that apply across? What is the definition? Is there a definition that would apply across countries, or are there variations within countries? So yes, I'll give the floor to any colleagues who want to answer, start with either of these questions until we have more.
Shaza, do you want me to reflect on the land rights quickly?
Yes, please. Yes, please, Tatiana.
So that was not a deliberate that we dropped it off. We knew that we only have 1.5 hours and so many important messages to share with you. Well, obviously, women's right to land is a rights issue, but it's also a governance issue. So when I speak about meaningful participation, and I mentioned a number of thematic and sectoral areas where women need to participate, that is often related to our practice on the ground. From our conflict analysis that we carry out in several countries, we see that local conflicts are often rising from the inequalities. Inequalities in access to information, inequalities in access to resources, inequalities in access to financing, and so on. And the biggest inequalities in access to natural resources. Main resources, land and water, come up very frequently because they are also helping women to provide the food for their families and their communities. So obviously women's access not only to land as such, but also to management of land as a resource is an important area that could be well developed into the project idea through this call. And focusing on productive resources, not only focusing on the livelihood support, but also maybe focusing on the land as an economic and productive resource for the entire community. So that That's a quick response, but there is also a very good policy report called Unlocking Peacebuilding Potential. I will put a link in the chat box where you can see a lot of policy recommendations very useful on this area. Thank you.
Colleagues, I can come on the question on definition of indigenous peoples. Is it okay?
Yes, yes, please.
Fantastic, yes. So just to quickly respond to that, no, we don't have a universal definition of who are indigenous peoples. But what we do then is we look at one of the most important international instruments that is specific to indigenous peoples, and that is ILO Convention 169 on indigenous and tribal peoples. This is the only legally binding instrument on the subject. And for those of you who are working in Latin America, this convention has been ratified by 22 countries, and if I'm not mistaken, about, I would say, 19 or 18 countries in Latin America. Almost all of them have ratified this convention. And based on this convention, it uses, and I would summarize it into two. There is a subjective criteria, and there is an objective criteria of not defining indigenous peoples, but identifying. So those two are different. Because the way international law look at indigenous peoples is, well, we tried to define them for more than 25 years, but we cannot define them. But we can identify them because they themselves, they don't want to be defined. So that's the approach that we need, that we look into. Because when we start to define who they are, the definition that we might end up putting might actually exclude others. So the approach that we are now using is don't define them, let them identify or self-identify themselves. So the most fundamental criteria that we look at when we're looking at indigenous people is self-identification. How does it work? So in the subjective criteria of who are indigenous peoples, the most important criteria is self-identification, belonging to an indigenous community. So for example, if I am, for example, a Mapuche from Chile, I would say that I am a Mapuche, and that would be enough. On the other hand, and there's a second part to that, then the members of that community, the organization, who are Mapuche organization, would say, yes, Morse is a Mapuche. He is a member of our community. So there's this self-identification, and there's this community ascription that would say yes. So that's one. And then, of course, the other criteria, the more objective that we use, are these are people or a descent from population who inhabited the country or a specific region at the time of conquest or colonization. Now, this is quite easy when you're looking at indigenous people in the Americas. But in other parts of the world, like Africa or Asia, the question is who came first and who came later? And then in addition to that confusion, of course, there's this whole criteria, objective criteria, that these people should have retained a certain or some part of their social, economic, cultural, or political institution, irrespective of their legal status. So that's the subjective and objective criteria that we are looking at. So I would repeat again, we don't have a universal definition, or I would say we don't have a UN definition of who are indigenous peoples, but we do use self-identification as a fundamental criteria. And that when we look at this fundamental criteria, there are two criteria. One is subjective, self-identification, and the other one is objective. Now, there's a question about, he was saying that there is a 15 list of countries. The 15 list of countries, in fact, these are the countries that are identified. I think we have 21 countries, I think, as a priority country for this fund. And I'm just looking at the countries that are listed in there. And I based that on the countries where we have had, for example, former fellows. So our Indigenous Fellowship Program at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we have now fellows from more than 90 countries. And I was telling you before, the criteria, again, that we use when these people apply is they self-identify themselves as such. But I can tell you as well that in many cases, in many parts of the world, I mean, the concept of indigenous people is very new. They don't even know that there's a concept of indigenous peoples. So what happened is that there are peoples in the world, they call themselves in their own languages. So for example, people would say Native people, Aboriginal people, First Nations. If you are in South Asia, they would say Adivasi, Jana Janati, hunter and gatherers, hill tribes, and it's fine. So if they self-identify themselves as such, or they will give their name. For example, I come from a Kalinga or an Ibanag community, and we are indigenous in my community in the Philippines based on our constitution. Now, in other parts of the world, the constitutions, there are policies and programs. The government identified those people. But as I had mentioned, that's not even the job of the government to define who are indigenous peoples. So let the people define who they are. Okay. And I would be happy, colleagues, those of you who mentioned that, those who are asking the 15 countries where we have indigenous peoples, you can send me your email and I'll be happy to help you in the identification of those countries where we do have indigenous people. Some of those countries, either they have ratified ILO Convention 169, so it would mean that if they have ratified that, when it means that that they do have indigenous peoples in their country, and that they want that convention to be applicable in their country. Now, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, this is a declaration, the only one that we have. It was adopted by 157 member states when it was adopted in 2007, and that is almost, I would say 80%, 90% of the world member of the UN. So, and some members of the state have also changed their position afterwards. So yes, we do have indigenous peoples in almost all countries, almost all regions in the world.
Thank you, Morris. I think I'll answer just a couple of questions here. One on can non-eligible CSOs for direct PBF funding be local implementing partners? Yes, they can. Since they're not eligible, they can't receive direct funding, but they can be local implementing partners in proposals submitted by others. There is I think we had a colleague from Somalia who I think a couple of times asked about the application of the indigenous concept on the Somali context. I think, as you rightfully identify the group as marginalized, even if it's not, I mean, and Morse, please feel free to jump in here, even if they don't identify as indigenous, or that definition isn't, or that phrase or that concept isn't exchanged there, being marginalized and is I think enough for this call. For this round of call.
Indeed, yes. Sometimes they call them the most marginalized, excluded population, exactly. And all that, yes.
The focus is really on civic space for this call and expansion of civic space and the engagement within civic space, regardless of this denomination. But however, as we said, we just highlighted certain groups and mentioning indigenous groups and peoples as something we'd really like to see more of. However, it doesn't mean other excluded groups in those contexts can be engaged or looked at in this call. Other questions back to. Again, we'll draw on you, Morris. This is also about the participation of Indigenous women in peace processes. And also our UN women colleagues, if they have any points to answer to this question. How do you combat cultural beliefs and also bringing in Indigenous men who are the masters or controllers of these beliefs? And they cite an example from the Cameroon with the Mbororo indigenous communities.
Right. Very quickly here, on the issue of the example that that our colleague Ramatu has raised here. Indeed, we need to be very clear here. There are traditional practices of indigenous communities that are harmful to specific members of their communities, and that is specific for many. It's for indigenous women or youth. And Ramatu has just raised this issue about how can indigenous women participate in peace process. We have seen that in many parts of the world, in Guatemala, in Mexico, even in Nepal. Indigenous women played a very important role in the peace process. I don't think we can really have a meaningful peace process if one sector of our population or a majority of that population are not going to play an important role. I think this is where peace process should be inclusive. The UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People talks about participation, pre-prior and informed consent, consultation. So we have to make sure that that those rights are articulated in that declaration is embedded in the way we work with indigenous peoples. So we have to ensure that that we have a specific mechanisms in involving indigenous women, that we can't continue if it's necessary to have a consultation mainly with them, directly with them, and that's great, because we have seen in my own when I go on mission, I have seen how indigenous women immediately it goes on the other side of the room when we have meetings and all that. But of course we can also proactively develop those mechanisms to ensure that that they will be a part of the process, and I would be happy to provide you with with good practices on those. And there is a global network of indigenous women. I think in almost every single UN processes where you have women in there is always a caucus of indigenous women. So I'll be happy to to link with some of our known indigenous women leaders to help you articulate those.
Okay, thank you, Joel. The other question, I think I will go back to our OHCHR colleagues. There's a question asking about tools recommended to use on social protest, peace building, and civic space. If there's any tool we can think of or have a resource that we have addressing the issue of social protest and civic space. And I think also another question is, can cultural diversities be a threat to space? And
yes, hello, I can answer. This is Birgit. I just posted a link to the UN guidance on protests. I'm not sure it's an official link, but the documents are the ones that are that we are using. It was also that guidance was also the result of a process, of a UN-wide process that came up with a number of key recommended actions and some communication related recommendations, but it's focused on how the UN should react to protests. And in terms of the question about cultural diversity and civic space, I mean, of course, it'll be, as every communication, it'll be easier when people speak the same language and have similar cultural reference points and so on. But the idea is really that civic space can accommodate a lot of diversity and should actually find ways. Yeah, the kind of challenge is to find ways to accommodate diversity. That's why I always put a lot of emphasis on this question of access to information, because I think it's also one of the more overlooked aspects that we need to make sure we all talk about the same things by translating what we are talking about into languages that are understood, and by using the channels that people actually not only can access but also want to access and feel safe to access. So I think really civic space, if it's functioning, it actually celebrates diversity and tries to make sure that the different voices come together and together figure out the best solutions for the future for the different communities concerned by by whatever kind of project or draft law or a specific peace related challenge. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Birgit. I'll also answer a question on should a proposal either for gender or youth focus on all aspects, resources, indigenous as well as environmental, or can it focus on one aspect? No, it doesn't have to focus on all aspects. And I think this comes down to your conflict analysis and your peace building issue that you want to address. It's and the conflict and the issues that you identify in your analysis and your intervention, and it doesn't have to cover all of them. It can definitely focus on one. It can focus on more than one. It would just be up to you to define the problem statement, the analysis, the gender issues, or the youth issues that you want to address, and therefore help you be, of course, the more specific you are, I think the better the quality of a proposal, and therefore that will really have to be a decision you'll have to make on what makes sense in terms of what issues you can address in the proposal. So again, it can be one, it could be more. It's really up to the context and the problem that you want to address. Morris had also shared examples of how Indigenous women could play in the peace process. Please look it up. There is one question. Yes, presentations and the recordings will be shared. There is a question on why Indigenous people are not given constructive exhibits, given the space to constructive exhibit and preserve their knowledge. So I guess maybe a question more speaking to why are Indigenous people marginalized and excluded? I think we can say. So maybe Morris, you can briefly.
Yeah, quickly here, because in many parts of the world, Indigenous peoples are not legally recognized. And if you are not legally recognized, and then of course all the other rights accorded to you, it's almost like a moot. Now, at the same time, of course, there's the historical injustices committed to them, and many, even in the most developed countries in the world, they struggle. So, and it's a pity because as I had mentioned before, if we are to look at ways and means in mitigating climate change, on the traditional knowledge would be very useful. There are so many examples. I mean, our modern medicine, 90%, 80%, according to research, our modern medicine are coming from traditional medicine of Indigenous peoples. Just by looking at that. So indeed, it's a pity that we look at in many parts of the world, when Indigenous people try to protect the environment, suddenly they are anti-development, and this is, and when Indigenous people try to raise their voice, they are seen as a terrorist, and this is an issue that is up today. It's taking place. It happened 500 years ago. It's still happening. So we have to find a way and how to engage them in a meaningful way. And that's my, we need to be more proactive, I guess. As we have a colleague mentioned before, they need to be in the driver's seat of the development. In the past, it has always been from the outside. I think it's about time that when we talk about development, we ask development for whom and for whom.
Thank you so much, Morris, and thank you very much, colleagues. I think looking at the, I think, you know, I had a lot of questions and we've answered them. Thank you very much for your engagement. Thank you very much to all the colleagues who participated in presenting. Amanda, Brigitte, Morris, Tatiana, Juo, and Yelva. I think we will wrap it, and for now, in a few minutes, the French version of this session, this webinar will start at 10 o'clock New York time. Again, the presentation will be shared with everyone. The link to the recording will be uploaded in our website, so you can definitely come and reference and see if there are any questions or anything that you would like to refer to again. These resources are also shared here in the chat, and we'll see how we can also make them available to everyone, all the resources that have been shared here. Again, thank you so much for your participation and your very positive engagement. We really look forward to your proposals and your brilliant ideas on how to address all these issues. And have a good day and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.